Hello, everybody. This is Mike History 2, and today I will be doing the United States versus the United Kingdom, Part 4, where I'll be talking about the Atlantic slave trade. And so, another atrocity that the United Kingdom and the United States worsened was the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade was the transportation by slave traders of enslaved African people, mainly from Africa to the Americas, and then their sale there. It existed from the 16th to the 19th century. The vast majority of those who were enslaved and transported in the transatlantic slave trade were Central and Western Africans who had been sold by other West Africans to Western European slave traders who brought them to the Americas. The Portuguese were the first to participate in the Atlantic slave trade in the 16th century, starting in 1526, when they completed the first transatlantic slave voyage to Brazil, and other European countries soon followed. Ship owners saw the slaves as cargo to be transported to the Americas as quickly and cheaply as possible. They were to be sold to work on coffee, tobacco, cocoa, sugar, and cotton plantations, gold and silver mines, rice fields, construction industry, cutting timber for ships, in skilled labor, and as domestic servants. As property, the people were considered merchandise or units of labor and were sold at markets with other goods and services. The major Atlantic slave trading countries were in order Portugal, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Several of these countries had established outposts on the African coast where they bought slaves from local African leaders. Slaves were kept in a factory while awaiting shipments. 12 million Africans died because of the slave trade, but the number of slaves bought was even higher. Near the beginning of the 19th century, various countries banned the trade. The Atlantic slave trade developed after trade contacts were established between Europe and the Americas. For centuries, nobody crossed the Atlantic, but in the 15th century, new European technology caused better ships to be built that could begin crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Between 1600 and 1800, approximately 300,000 slave traders bought slaves in Africa. The reason the Europeans were the first to do this was because they wanted to find new and profitable trade opportunities outside Europe, as well as the desire to create an alternative trade network that didn't go through the Middle East, which was viewed as a threat to Europe. In particular, European traders wanted to trade for gold, which could be found in Western Africa, and also to find a maritime route to India, where they could trade for luxury goods such as spices without having to get it from Muslim traders. The Atlantic slave trade was not the only slave trade from Africa. In fact, this Arab slave trade was even worse than this terrible atrocity, which I will make a video about sometime in the future. European demand for slaves provided a large new market for the already existing trade. Upon discovering new lands through their naval exploration, European colonizers soon began to migrate to settle in lands outside Europe. Castile conquered the Canary Islands during the 15th century. Using the Canary Islands as a naval base, Europeans, mainly Portuguese traders, began to move down the western coast of Africa, forming raids in which slaves would be captured. Although initially successful, it was not long before Africans began resisting. By 1494, Portugal decided to trade peacefully instead, which was mostly kept apart from some rare exceptions when there was violence. The Atlantic slave trade is divided into two eras, known as the First and Second Atlantic slave trade. The first one was the trade of Africans to Portugal and Spain's colonies, but was only 3% of the whole Atlantic slave trade. It started in 1526 and lasted until 1580 when Portugal was united with Spain. During the First Atlantic system, most of these traders were Portuguese. After the Union, Spain banned it from directly engaging in the slave trade. Spain's enemies, France, England, and the Netherlands, used this to start trading their own slaves. The Second Atlantic slave trade was the trade of enslaved Africans by mostly English, Portuguese, French, and Dutch traders. Most of the slaves went to the Caribbean and Brazil. 16% of slaves were traded during the 17th century. More than half of the entire slave trade happened during the 18th century, with the British, Portuguese, and French being the main Europeans involved. By the 1690s, the English were shipping the most slaves from West Africa. This continued throughout the 18th century, becoming the biggest shippers of slaves across the Atlantic. However, it was the Portuguese colony of Angola and nearby countries where most of the slaves came from. By the 18th century, Angola had become the main source of the Atlantic slave trade. Following the British and American bans on the African slave trade in 1808, it declined, but 28.5% of the Atlantic slave trade still happened after it was banned by those two countries. Soon a triangular trade was formed, starting with the export of goods from Europe to Africa. For each captive, the African rulers would receive a variety of goods from Europe. These included guns, ammunition, and other factory-made goods. Then Africans would be sent across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas and Caribbean islands. Finally, goods would return to Europe from the Americas. These goods were the products of slave labor plantations and included cotton, sugar, tobacco, molasses, and rum. Sir John Hawkins, considered the pioneer of the British slave trade, was the first to run the triangular trade, making a profit at every stop. The Atlantic slave trade was the result of labor shortage, which itself was caused by the desire of Europeans to exploit the Americas. Indigenous peoples were used at first as slave labor by Europeans until a large number died from overwork and diseases. Other sources of labor, such as indentured servitude, failed to get enough people working. Exporting goods from the New World to Europe often was more profitable than producing them in Europe. A lot of labor was needed to create and sustain plantations that required a lot of work to grow, harvest, and process valuable crops. The basic reason for the constant shortage of labor was that, with large amounts of cheap land available, lots of landowners searching for workers, European immigrants were able to become landowners themselves after a relatively short time, thus increasing the need for workers. Africans played a direct role in the slave trade, selling their captives or prisoners of war to European buyers. Africans also participated in the slave trade by marrying their people to Europeans to get an alliance used to strengthen their trade networks. Although Europeans were the market for slaves, Europeans rarely entered the interior of Africa because of fear of disease and African resistance. In the Americas, slaves were denied the right to marry freely, and masters did not generally accept them as equal members of the family. 50% of African deaths occurred in Africa as a result of wars between native kingdoms, which produced the majority of slaves. This included not only those who died in battles, but also those who died as a result of forced marches from inland areas to slave ports on the various western coasts. The practice of enslaving enemy combatants and their villages was widespread throughout western and west central Africa, although wars were rarely started to get slaves until some countries decided to do that later on. The kings of Dahomey sold war captives into slavery. They would otherwise have been killed in a ceremony known as the annual customs. Some countries even became dependent on the slave trade for the economy. After being marched to the coast for sale, enslaved people were held in large forts where about 4.5% of deaths happened. After being captured and held in the factory, slaves entered the mill passage, where 12.5% of the slaves died because of brutal treatment and poor care. The conditions on board also resulted in the spread of fatal diseases. Other fatalities were suicides, and slaves sometimes escaped by jumping overboard. Slave traders would try to put anywhere from 350 to 600 slaves on one ship. Mortality rates decreased over the history of the slave trade, primarily because the length of time necessary for the voyage was declining. The richest West Indian colonies 1800 belonged to the United Kingdom. British naval supremacy and control over key islands in the Caribbean and British Guiana gave it an important edge over all competitors. This advantage was reinforced when France lost its most important colony, Saint-Domingue, to a slave revolt in 1791, and supported revolts against its rival in Britain after the 1793 French Revolution in the name of liberty. After 1791, the British islands produced the most sugar, and the British people quickly became the largest consumers. Luckily, over time in Europe, opposition developed against the slave trade. Following William Murray, 1st Earl of Mansfield's decision in 1772, slaves became free upon entering the British Isles. In 1778, Virginia banned slaves from entering it, and all slaves smuggled in would be set free. Denmark was the first country to ban the trade in 1803. About 9% of the people who died in the slave trade were actually because of the British, who sent most of them not to the United States, like people think, but actually to the Caribbean. And the British caused about 1.5 million Africans to die. However, one thing that they did better than the United States was abolishing the slave trade in 1807, earlier than Americans, who did it the next year. The United Kingdom also helped end the slave trade. In 1810, the United Kingdom encouraged Portugal to restrict the slave trade, and in 1813 encouraged Sweden to ban its slave trade. In 1814, it also convinced France and the Netherlands to ban their slave trade. The United Kingdom sent a fleet to end the slave trade and make sure it would stop smugglers. In 1833, the United Kingdom abolished slavery, while the Americans fought their bloodiest war in history over it. Spoiler alert. And that's it. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Guys, please subscribe. I'm trying to reach 200 subscribers. But today, instead of getting even one subscriber, all I did was lose 4 of them. So, I mean, if we're gonna get to 200, I can't be losing 4 a day. Anyways, see you later.